So, good afternoon. I just want to mention before starting that I'm not a mathematician, so I'm coming from geophysics, and I will try here to give you some idea of what are the data in geophysics and how we can use numerical modeling or mathematical modeling to interpret this data, not just by simulating things and comparing with some data, but by going deep into data analysis. So. And more specifically, I will focus here on how we can extract information of geophysical mass movements. And by that I mean, for example, landslide or glacier, and how we can get such information from the seismic waves that this mass generated when they move. And this is a work in collaboration with a lot of people in geophysics and especially in mathematics, but also in physics, acoustics, etc. So during the first two lessons, I will focus on landslides and speak about the seismic waves that are generated by landslide. And you will see that these seismic waves are very rich and they contain what we call a large frequency band. You have what we call low frequency, and I will go back to that, and high frequency, and we need different numerical modeling and different analysis to extract information from these two kinds of waves. And I will show you that if we use modeling, for example, we can extract a lot of information on landslide from the waves, and after that we can monitor landslide activity and try to relate it, for example, with climatic change or volcanic activity, etc. So this will be the outline of the talk that I will give today and a little bit tomorrow. After, I will focus a little bit more on mathematical and numerical modeling of these flows. So here you will not have a lot of equations, and tomorrow not also comparing to what you are used to, I guess. And the last talk, I will speak about glacier, and that we can analyze in kind of the same methodology, but obviously in different context. So first, why are we interested in landslide? Actually, landslide occur all over the world, but also on different planets, as for example on Mars. And I don't know if you are aware of that, but recently we sent a seismometer on Mars, and it has been designed by our group, our IPGP group. And this is the first seismometer on Mars, and we hope to record a lot of events that occur on Mars, and maybe some landslide can be recorded. And so as you can see here in this picture, you have, for example, landslides that occur on some volcanoes in Stromboli here, and they go down the sea here, generate tsunami, for example. And here you can see what a seismometer records. And this is the first landslide. Here you can see the low frequency signal, which is the tsunami waves. And on top of that, you can see another landslide. So here it's just by looking at that, but you can see that we can extract, just by analyzing this, a lot of information on these flows. So what is very important, obviously, is for hazard assessment. So what we want to know, for example, is how far a landslide can go, which is called the runout distance. We want to know how fast it will be, to see how it will impact infrastructures, for example. And the problem of that, when we try to predict these events, is that we don't know really what is the rheological or mechanical behavior of these flows. And what we observe is that they go much further than what we would expect if we would have put a classical friction law. And I will go into details into that. So this is a big issue. How to quantify what we call the high mobility of natural landslides. And one of the big problems for that is that we lack really field measurement of the dynamics of landslide. In general, you go to the field and you see that, which means you see only the deposit and you have no idea about the velocity of the landslide. And if you just have the deposit, you can reproduce it with a lot of models, and it will not be possible then to predict other landslides. So this is one of the big issues here. And also a big issue, obviously, is to detect this landslide and to quantify them. For example, if you have a volcano here, you have the magma that is pushing the volcano that will deform, and you will have a lot of rockfalls or debris avalanche here. And the question is how much the volcanic activity is related, for example, to the granular flows that occur on the flank of the volcanoes. And another way is, if we are able to detect and quantify the volume of this rockfall, could we have some idea about what happened deep, how fast the magma will push the volcano, etc. So there is a strong link between this gravitational activity and volcanic forcing, for example, or obviously a strong link between climatic change and landslide, because there is more and more landslide due to this climatic change. So recently in our community we have studied the seismic waves that are generated by these flows. So, for example, if you have a landslide here, this occurred in Montserrat Island. This is in the Antilles. When the granular mass is flowing down the slope, it makes some vibration on the ground that you can record very far. And this is an example of the signal here. And here, this is the ground velocity. You see it's very small. It's meter per second, so 10 to the minus 5 meter per second. You cannot feel it, for example, but if you put the seismometer, you will record these waves. And this is time here, and the duration here is typically 100 or 200 seconds. And if you look at the signal here, you see what we call noise here. And the noise actually is not really noise. It has been shown that it's generated by the ocean waves during the storms in the north and south polar pole. So this is something that is really much studied now in seismology, and we try to extract information from this noise. But here we will be interested in this signal that is related to these gravitational flows, and we will look at this here. And what is interesting is that if you have, for example, a landslide of 1 million of cubic meter, you will be able to record it, for example, at 200 or 800 kilometers from the landslide. So then you don't have to be on the site to be able to recover its volume, for example, or other characteristics. And if I have time, during the last lesson, I will speak about another geophysical mass movement, which is related to the glacier. So you have glacier that goes into the sea, and when they melt, they generate very big iceberg, like in Greenland, for example, 1 kilometer size iceberg. And this iceberg generates also seismic signal that we can analyze. And from this, we can recover the mass of the iceberg and quantify the ice mass loss in Greenland, for example. And in 2 days, I will be there to put some seismometers there. So if we now start with a landslide, so I just want to show you a movie so that you can have an idea of what happened. This is in Piton de la Fournaise volcano, in the crater Dolomieu. And you can see one rockfall here that we have recorded with camera. You can see some blocks that impact the ground. And here is the signal that we record on a seismometer that we put 500 meters from this rockfall. And you can see that the duration of this seismic signal is about the same as the duration of the rockfall. And we can calculate a seismic energy here that increases with time and then decreases as the flow accelerates and decelerates down the slope. So just by eye, we can see that there is some relation between the physical process and the seismic waves that we record. So the big issue is how can we get quantitative information on this rockfall just by analyzing this seismic signal. And what we have shown, and I mean over the world in the community, is that if we associate accurate measurement of the flow dynamics by analysis of seismic waves to numerical modeling of the physical process, then we can recover, for example, the landslide volume or the friction coefficient of the low that we put in the model, etc. It's not possible just by looking at the maximum amplitude, for example, and associate it to a volume. This is too complicated. But by simulating really the whole process and comparing with the seismic data, then I will speak about that, you can extract very unique information from these waves. And until recently, there have been really two parallel developments. Some people that were really developing accurate methods for seismic wave analysis, and others that developed high accuracy numerical models for granular flows, but the difficulty is to put them together. And typically, what we have to do, and what we do in general in geophysics, is that we develop in parallel different type of studies. And for example, here, what we want to do is to characterize and quantify the mechanical behavior of landslides. And to do that, we develop numerical model, mechanical and numerical model of landslide. And this is something that we do in collaboration with mathematicians. And together we develop laboratory experiments to try to test these models in some way, to see if, for example, the landslide model has a good mechanical behavior compared to granular flows at the lab scale. And when we do that, then we compare with real data. In general, we have to do that again and again to see the difference between laboratory experiments and field data, for example. And we have to improve the models, etc. So I will show you a little bit of examples from all these paths of studies. So first we will look at what we call the modeling of low frequency signal. And by low frequency, I mean signal between 20 and 100 seconds. So I apologize because in seismology we always switch between frequency and periods. So when we speak about low frequency, we give periods. For example, we say 10 to 200 seconds. And when we speak about high frequency, we give the number in frequencies. So it will be, you have to have the 1/x button to translate. For me, it was maybe 3 years before being used to that, and now I cannot go back. So, okay. So again, what you have is this seismic signal here, and this is a seismic signal from a landslide that I will speak about later. And in black, you can see what we call the raw data. It means what you record on your seismometer. And now I can filter this signal. For example, I can filter it between 1 and 10 seconds, and you can get this purple signal. And I can filter it in very low frequency, 20 to 100 seconds, which is the blue line here, which is what I will work on now. So it's very low frequency, and I will explain you what is inside this signal. So the big issue, obviously, when you have the seismic signal, is that it comes from a convolution between the source and the wave path from the source to the station where you record your signal. So if you want information on the source, you have to make a deconvolution to remove what happened between the source to the seismic station where you record the signal. I don't know if it will work here, but I just wanted to show you a movie of seismic wave propagations. If you have a source here, you have a seismic waves that propagate, and these waves are sensible to the Earth's heterogeneity and also to the topography along the path. And why it is more easy to analyze low frequency signal is because they are not sensible or very poorly sensible to that. For example, the period between 20 and 100 seconds, you have typical wavelengths of 45 kilometers. So then you will not see this crater, for example, that has a typical size of 1 kilometer. Then it is more easy. And this is what I will present before. So what happened at the source? So you have your landslide, which is a granular mass here, and you have some blocks that impact the ground. And the low frequency signal is related to the acceleration-deceleration of the flow. When you accelerate and decelerate, the force that you apply on the ground change, and this generates seismic waves. But also, if you have individual impacts, you feel that you generate higher frequency signal. So the signal is a sum of all this, and the trick is to isolate the effect to try to go back to the physical process. And the force that is exerted by the landslide on the ground depends on a lot of things. So you have a signature of the mass. If you have a bigger mass, naturally you will have a bigger amplitude of the signal. It depends on the geometry of the mass. It depends on the rheology, on the topography, particle agitation, fluid content, etc. So you see that there is a very big challenge to decorrelate all this effect. And the only way to do that, in fact, is to have a good physical model that describes quantitatively the link between these processes. So first, I will go very quickly about how to deconvolute the signal. So if you have the source here, the landslide is here, and you record your signal here, then you want to remove this, which is the response of the Earth to the seismic waves. And this is very classical in seismology. We have tools to do that. And what we do, we calculate the Green's function of the Earth. I don't know if everybody knows what is it. The Green function is the response to an impulsive force. And we have some models to do that. And what we say is that what we record here at the station, U, the displacement of the ground, is a convolution of the Green's function, so the response of the Earth, with the force that is at the source here. And what we do, we go to the Fourier domain, we make a Fourier transform, and then we can recover the force by deconvolution of the recorded signal with the Green's function. And when we go back to the time domain, we get the force that the landslide exerts on the ground. So during this process, what we have done, we have removed the Earth's response. And what is very interesting is that we can recover the force that the landslide applied to the ground just by using one station. We don't need a lot of stations. If you have just one station somewhere, you can recover the force. And I give you some example of the force that people recovered, and it was done really long time ago, and it has been a little bit forgotten, and now there is more and more people trying to work on that because we have new tools to analyze the data. So here is a signal that you can record at the different seismic station here. And this seismic station are very far from the landslide. For example, here it's a landslide that occurred in Mont Sainte-Hélène It was one of the biggest landslides, and it is very famous. It occurred in 1980, and you recorded it up to 1,000 kilometers from the landslide. A seismic station 1,000 kilometers away recorded these waves. And at that time, it was done by Kanamori in particular. He's a very famous seismologist. He deconvolved this signal and found this kind of force. You see a positive force and a negative force. And this is really related to this acceleration-deceleration process. And so different groups did that. And I show you an example of what we did in 2012. And you can see in red here the force that we obtain by deconvolution of the signal recorded at one station. And you can see that you can see this force here that is a little bit more complex than just a positive and negative part. And this is due to the interaction with topography, etc. And I will go into more detail into that. You have a vertical north and east force, and it's quite big. Huh? It's 10 to the power 11 Newton, the force that the landslide exerts on the ground. And just to explain you a little bit what happened, you have a mass here. If you have high slope here, slopes that are higher than the friction coefficient of the block on the ground, then the block will accelerate. So you have an acceleration like this, and then you have a reaction that is opposite to the acceleration. And this is this first part of the force. Then the block decelerates because it reaches smaller slope, and then you have a deceleration, and then a force opposite to this deceleration. It's why you have positive, negative force. So you can see that we had, from this, we had information that we never had before. We are able to reconstruct the acceleration, deceleration of the mass, and it gives some idea of the dynamics of the flow. Oui. Ah, yeah, sorry. I just described the red one because the other, I will describe them later because it's due to numerical modeling. Okay. So I just, I don't know how to say in English, but related to what you say, you see that what we want to be able to do is to simulate this force, because if we are able to simulate it, maybe we have a good model for the dynamics of the flow. And this is really the idea.
Just another question. Do we know the spectrum of the wave generated by the friction force? I mean, when you have that accelerating mass.
Yes.
So when you have that accelerating mass, I mean the waves it generates, do we know what is the spectrum of that?
You mean in terms of frequency, you mean? Yeah, it's a very broad spectrum between maybe 120 seconds to more than 20 hertz. And it's a very large frequency band. Yeah. And here, what I represented here is the low frequency part. Okay. So I filtered it between 20 and 100 seconds. Okay. I will speak later about high frequencies.
Okay, but for the broad shape of that curve of spectrum, we have an a priori idea, or we just reconstruct it depending on the experiment?
Sorry, can you repeat?
I mean, we know what range of frequencies it covers, but for the shape it has, depending on the frequency, we have some a priori knowledge about it? Or?
I mean, we have some knowledge. In fact, we know about that, for example, between 1 and 100 seconds, this is related to acceleration, deceleration. Okay. We know that for higher frequency is related to grain collisions, but everything depends on the mass, and I will show it later. You will see how the frequency depends on the characteristics of the flow.
Okay, thanks.
So if I go back to this landslide that I show that you can see here in red. So what happened in the field? It was a landslide that occurred in Mont Steller, It's a mixture of rock and ice avalanche. And here you have the Mont Steller. It is in Alaska. And what happened is that the mass here flows down the slope and eroded during its path some material along the slope. And then the mass was getting bigger and bigger due to this erosion. And the question is, are we able to quantify how much material was eroded by the flow? Is it possible? Because on the field it's quite hard to do that. And so this landslide occurred here. This is the red star here. And it has been recorded by all these stations that you can see in purple here. Some of them are very far, 600 kilometers from the source. You can see again the signals that I showed you before. And the low frequency signal between 20 and 80 seconds here in blue. Now you remember it's related to this acceleration, deceleration that is complexified by the interaction with topography. So now, sorry. So, okay. So when you see that, as I showed you before, you want to be able to simulate the force. So now you have to use some models. And I will just speak a little bit about models here, and I will speak more tomorrow. But just to show you what kind of model we are generally using for simulating natural landslides. So if you see, this is a landslide here, for example, and what you can see is that landslides are obviously really, so their motion depends on the first order on the topography. So if you want to be able to simulate real flows, you have to take into account accurately topography, which means that you have to have a lot of grid points to describe your topography, which means that you have to, it is very expensive in terms of computational costs. So we have to make some approximation, and we cannot use Navier-Stokes equations on the complex topography to simulate real landslide at the moment. It will maybe come in next years, but at the moment it's really too expensive. So what people did is to try to make a reasonable approximation. And the approximation that is mostly used is very classical, is what we call shallow water or thin layer approximation, which means that the thickness of the landslide is supposed to be smaller compared to the length of the landslide. And it is generally true, except during the first collapse of the landslide. And this approximation can be compared to shallow water approximation that is used for tsunami waves or things like this. So there is a cutting of the... okay. So what we introduce a small aspect ratio, epsilon, which is h over L, which is supposed to be small compared to 1. And we make other approximation. We say this thickness here of the flow. So this is the landslide, this is the topography here. The thickness is of order epsilon. The gradient of the topography is also supposed to be small, of order epsilon. And what we do, as in shallow water approximation, we work on average quantities, and we work on the mean velocity. And here we mean mean velocity in this direction. And this is very important because for tsunami waves, for example, we average everything in the vertical direction. But here, to be correct, you have to average the things perpendicularly to the topography. If you don't do that, you make very big error. And this is a tricky part of avalanche modeling, and that has been in part solved by our colleagues in mathematics, François Bouchu in particular, to write this complex equation over a complex topography by really assuming that the flow is shallow in this direction compared to this direction. So when you do this approximation, you get very simple balance between inertia here. Here you have the gravity, that is the driving force of the landslide. And here you see G is the gravity acceleration, and this is the projection of the gravity along the topography. You have the pressure gradient here. If you have a higher mass here, it will push the landslide in this direction, and the contrary for the slope in the other direction. And the very important terms is the dissipation term, the friction term. And in landslide model, we generally take into account what we call Coulomb friction law. And what is Coulomb friction? It says that the shear stress is proportional to the normal stress times a friction coefficient. The classical idea is the block model. If you have a block, you say that the friction is opposite to the motion and proportional to the weight of the block and depend on the friction coefficient. So everything in some way is put in this friction coefficient here, and the friction coefficient is a tangent on the friction angle. And to have an idea of what it means, the friction angle is if you take some bits or some sand on the beach, for example, you can construct a triangle with that, and the stability angle is the friction angle. And the friction coefficient is a tangent of this friction angle. And typical value of friction angle for glass bits, for example, is 25 degrees. And for debris, if you go on the mountain for hiking, you see slopes of 35 degrees when you have debris on the slopes. So this is typical value of these materials. So if you look at this friction law, so I said that this is the friction coefficient, and here this is the normal stress in this direction, the white of the column, and here you have terms that is related to the curvature of the topography. So if you have a topography that goes like this, then you are like as if you are pushed down. If you have a topography like this, you are pushed up, and this is what you see when you go to some Russian mountain. I don't know how to say it in English, but okay. So this is a term that is very important for natural landslide because the avalanche always go in holes and on bumps, and they are very affected by this. I will have no time to show you here, but it is a term that you have to take into account. So here you see the 1D equations are quite simple, but it was a big deal to write this equation over a complex topography in 3D. And it is a code, for example, it has been done in Chaltop by François Bouchu, our colleague since several years. And I just wanted to show you the equations without deriving it, because it can take several lessons to do that. And so here you recognize mass equations, the mass conservation equation, where h is the thickness. This is the cosine of the slope angle, and u is the velocity. And here, this is the momentum equation here, sorry. And you can see that you recover the acceleration term. Here is the gradient of the pressure. Here B is the topography. And you have some terms where you see a new variable, which is h here, which is the curvature tensor of the topography. It's not just the curvature radius here. It's you have 4 coefficients, which is the curvature tensor here. So now we have some models that describe this complex topography. So if we go back, so you have a model that describes the thickness and mean velocity evolution of the flow over a complex topography. And this is the friction coefficient, and I just told you that it was tangent of the friction angle, so a constant friction coefficient. But there are more complex rheological laws that have been partly developed, for example, by Pouliquin and Forter and EUC here, and other physicists in granular material, that says that the friction angle is not a constant, but depends on the flow, for example, on the thickness of the flow, on the velocity through the fluid number, etc. I will not enter into these details here, but just to know that we can have more complex friction load than just a constant friction coefficient. So now let us go back to the data, to the field, and we take this kind of model and we simulate a real landslide here. So if you remember, we want to simulate the landslide that occurred in Mont Stellaire, and we want to know if we have a different behavior, if the landslide is flowing down just like this, or if it erodes mass on the path. So to do that, we simulate different scenarios. So first, we put the whole mass on top of the mountain, we release it, and here in color, you can see how the flow moves down the slope. And the different color here represents the thickness of the flow. So you can see that you have the whole thickness here, and then you have a small thickness here, higher thickness here, and this is the deposit here. So this is one scenario where all the mass is released from here. And now what happens if you just release one part of the mass, and here there is some mass that can be eroded when this mass reaches this position. So this is what happened at time 0. Then later on you have this mass that reaches this erodible mass, and you can see like a waves here with higher thickness that propagate on the erodible bed. And this is something that we can see in laboratory experiments. I will not show you here, but we can really see these erosion waves in the experiment of granular flows. And at the end, you have this deposit here. So now let us look from the top here. And it is what we obtain in this, if we look at this from the top, and if we look at this at the top. And in black here, this is what we observed on the field. This is the deposit that you observed. So you can see that if you just have the area of the deposit, you are not able to say which model is the best, which scenario is the best, because with the two models, you just have to change the friction coefficient and you recover the deposits. If you would have been able to have the thickness distribution, which is represented by these different colors here, then you would have been able to say if this is more this or this one. But it's very difficult on the field to have this thickness distribution, because what it means that you have to go before, have the digital elevation model, then just after, and make the difference between the two digital elevation models. It's something which is quite difficult to do. So what we wanted to see is the signature of this process encoded in the seismic waves. And now, if we compare the force simulated by the model in this scenario with the force simulated by this scenario, are they different? And which one fits better the force that we inverted from seismic data? It is a strategy that we followed. So I go back to the curve that I showed you before. So remember, the red one is the force inverted from the seismic data in the vertical north and east direction. And now the colors represent the two models that I showed you before. So the green model is without erosion. So without erosion is this scenario when I just release everything from the top. So this is the green one, and you see that the force is very different from the red force that I recorded from seismic data. And now if I compare with the scenario with erosion, this scenario with erosion is this one. Oh, sorry. Then you can see that the blue curve, it's much better fits the data. Obviously, it's not perfect. If you look at the different components, you don't get exactly the force history. And this is due to a lot of reasons that we can speak about later. But still, you can see that the scenario with erosion is better reproduce the seismic signal. And it means that maybe we have the signature of the erosion process encoded in the force. And in fact, when we tried several different scenarios, we were able to try to fit better the waveform of the force, and we were able to say that what was the best scenario was 20 million of cubic meter eroded, which was about at 50% the same of what is observed on the field. So the thing is that the message to go home in some way is that we can use simulation to test if the models are good by comparing with seismic inversion. And obviously what we need is better models that have better physics. And for example here, better erosion laws to better extract information. It is a general thing. So now you will say, okay, but it depends on the parameters that you put on the model. You change the friction coefficient, then you will be able to get better force, etc. And I will try to show you that even if we have different parameters to invert, for example, the mass or the friction, still we can invert all this, and they don't make the force vary in the same way. So, for example, now let us look at more details. So, what happened? This is another landslide, and we did that with a lot of landslide. And what is interesting in this landslide is that you have a strong effect of topography. You have different bends here. So the initial mass is here, and in yellow here, you have the force inverted from seismic signal. It was the red force that I showed you, but now I draw it at different time here as time change, and you see that the direction of the force changes. And I put also to compare the force that is simulated by the model in black. You can see that at different time, this force coincides in direction and amplitude. And from this, you can see that we have a lot of data now. At each time, we have a direction and an amplitude to really constrain the model. And so you can see that, for example, when the landslide turns on a bend, then you have this centrifugal force that are related to the U square over the curvature tensor. And you have the direction of acceleration that is perpendicular to the direction of the flow. So this is also a strong constraint. So now, if we come back to the way I presented the force before, so you have vertical north and east direction as a function of time, and the red one is the force inverted from seismic signal, and this is another landslide compared to the one I showed you before. And if you look at the force, you can see it's very different from the force that I showed you before. We don't see acceleration and deceleration. We see, for example, here 3 bumps. And by looking at what happened, actually, we saw that it was 3 different landslides that occurred, one after each other. So this was not possible to observe just by looking at the deposit, because you just see a deposit. But when you look at this time series, you can say that actually it was 3 different masses. And when you simulate it and vary the friction angle in the model here, you can see that we get several simulated forces here. And the best model that represents the data is the black model here. And you can see that it's better than the other, but still it is not perfect at all. You have strong difference with the data, but you are not far of the uncertainty of the inverted force that is represented by this pink area. So now, if we try to understand why we are able to do that and what is the uncertainty on the parameters that we recovered by this comparison. So to do that, we made some what we call synthetic tests. It means that it's not a real landslide, but we do some simulations. We take this simulation as if it was some data and try to test our method. So here you have a plane here, and you have a mass that you release on the plane. And this mass has a particular volume and geometry. So the thickness of the mass is h0, its length is L0, and its width is W0. And we put a friction coefficient in the model, which is tangent of delta, where delta is a friction angle. So we make the simulation, and at the end you obtain this deposit. So the color represents the thickness of the mass. And so we try to see if we can recover these parameters, for example, only by trying to simulate the deposit, the runout, which is the maximum length, the area of the deposit, or if we use the force calculated by the model to invert and recover the three parameters. So here is the force simulated with the simulation here. So you have the vertical force in red here, so you can see the acceleration, deceleration. This force is along the slope, and if you look at this direction, you have a zero force, because this force is average over the whole space. What I showed you since the beginning is not the force at each position. At what time I average the force over the whole domain. It's like a point source force. So let us try to recover these four parameters. So for example, if we would have only the runout as a data, it was what we had before. We only had runout data or area of the deposits. So if you have the runout data and you do a lot of simulation and try to fit your runout data by changing H0, L0, W0 and delta using Bayesian inversion, then you recover this kind of distribution function of your parameters for the thickness, length, width and friction angle. And here in dashed line, it is the real data that you put initially in your model. It's your real parameter. You see that you are really not able to recover the data that you put in the model just by comparing with runout distance. Now you try to compare with the area of the deposit here, and it is even worse actually. You are not able to find the initial values that you put into your model. And now if you use the force here, you recover very well the initial thickness, the length, the width is not as well recovered, and the friction coefficient. It really shows that if you have the force, you can go back to the friction and geometrical parameter. And I don't know if you understood why this is not so good reproduced. This is the width of the mass. And actually, it's related to the fact that the simulation is symmetrical. So you sum up the mass, the force in this direction, it gives zero. So it has no information. If you would have a complex topography, then you will have an information in this direction. So for this kind of things, the topography helps constraining the model. And obviously, if you had the real distribution of the thickness of the deposit, then you would be even better able to recover your data. But it is something that is very hard to recover on the field. So now if we apply this to a landslide, that as I showed you before, for example, it's a big landslide that occurred in Montserrat. Then we did a lot of simulation, we inverted the force, and we were able to recover the friction coefficient, thickness, width, and length of the landslide. And when we calculate the volume, it makes a volume of about 45 million of cubic meter, which was about the same as what was observed on the field. So you can see that with this kind of techniques, we are able to recover geometrical parameters, so the volume of the mass and the friction coefficient, for example. So now if we try to look not at each landslide and try to get some more general information, So if we put the friction coefficient that we recovered from this inversion as a function of the volume of the landslide, so the seismic inversion are represented by this rectangle here in different colors. And when you can see what is kind of strange is that the friction coefficient that you have to put in your model decreases as the volume of the landslide increases. So I don't know if you remember the typical friction angle of debris, which was about 35 degrees. If you have a big landslide as the one I showed you, the friction angle is about 15 degrees. It's much smaller. So you don't know why, but the dissipation in real landslide is very small compared to dissipation in granular flows. And this is really an open question, and nobody really knows why, to which physical process this is related. And this is something that we can observe. I will maybe not go into that, but okay. So if we do some simulation, as I show you, you have a decreasing friction coefficient as a function of volume. And to try to see which friction law we can reconstruct from that, we use the simulation, because we know that the dynamics of the simulation is not so bad, because it fits the seismic inversion. And we are able to put the friction coefficient as a function of the flow velocity that we calculated by the model. And we see what we call a friction weakening law, that the friction coefficient decreases with the velocity of the flow. And this is completely opposite to granular law, like, for example, the Pouliken and Forter friction law, which gives a friction coefficient that increases with the velocity. So we see that what is observed on the field involves maybe different physics to what is observed at the laboratory scale. So, I show you a little bit what we can do with low frequency data, but it's only part of this signal, the low frequency data, and we have a lot of data at higher frequencies. And as I told you, it is related to this kind of collision between the grains, and in granular flows, this collision is related to the agitation of the granular particles, which is called granular temperature. And we know that it is something that can be important in rheological laws. So we wonder if it's possible to measure this kind of granular temperature by interpreting the high-frequency seismic signal. And this is really an open question, but I will show you that we can go in this direction. So the last part of the course of today will focus on that, on this high-frequency seismic signal, and I will spend a lot of time maybe on laboratory experiments to show you what we can extract from them. Okay, so here you can see a laboratory experiment. So because on the field, as you have seen, it's very complicated. You have sometimes ice, you have complex topography. It's not possible to have movies because they occur in emplacement where we cannot put cameras, or if the camera captures a landslide, it is destroyed by the landslide, etc. So to make this easier to understand, we do these laboratory experiments, and this is something that we do often in geophysics. So here you have the granular mass here. It kind of mimics a landslide. We release this mass and we measure the seismic signal that is generated at the lab scale. So you will see the movie of the mass here. So we remove the cap, the mass is spreading. We measure the thickness. And at the same time, we measure the seismic signal generated at the lab scale by combining acoustic sensor with cameras. And from this, normally, we could be able to to make some relation between the measured mass and the measured acoustic waves. Okay, so this is typically what we do. You have a lot of bits in a granular column. You remove the granular column, and then you have the flow. And with the camera, you measure the flow up to the deposit here. And you try to relate the seismic parameters. So seismic parameter is the seismic envelope, seismic energy, mean frequency, as you asked. And you try to relate it to the flow speed, for example, to the loss of potential energy, etc. So the first thing that happens, if you look at the data, is that if you represent the cumulative seismic energy, which is called here WEL for elastic energy, you will see after why I call it elastic energy. And so this is the full line here, and this is obtained as a function of time for different slope angle. So first I release the mass on horizontal planes and incline the plane up to 20 degrees. And you can see that for zero angle it has this kind of shape, and when you incline the plane it lasts longer, and you have this kind of shapes. And when you compare the seismic energy with the loss of potential energy here, represented with this dashed line, you see that it evolves very similarly. So the loss of potential energy is converted into seismic energy, and you have a close relation between the two. And it is very useful because it means that if you have your seismic signal, you measure seismic energy, and you are able to reconstruct the loss of potential energy as a function of time. And also what is interesting, if we want to have quantitative value of the loss of potential energy, for example, then we have to know how much loss of potential energy is converted into seismic energy, and it's very small actually. It's 10 to the power minus 4. There is only a very small part of the energy that is converted into seismic waves, but still we can measure it with our instruments, and we don't really wonder if it's small or not as soon as we can measure it and as soon as we have quantification of this ratio. And so just, if you have the movies that I showed you before, and here you have the seismic energy as a function of time for real rockfall here, and you will see that it is quite similar in shape, obviously, as those that are observed at the laboratory scale. So we can make a parallel of what happened at the lab scale to what happened at the field scale. So now the question is what empirical law can we build that will relate seismic energies to, for example, the height of the column or the mass of the column or the aspect ratio? And maybe it's related also to the speed of the mass. And also, as I showed you before, what is the role of the velocity fluctuation, which is the granular temperature, the collisions, in the generation of these waves. So I show you some experiments, and I will show you some empirical laws that we were able to derive from this experiment. So here, for example, we release a granular mass over a horizontal plane, and we just vary the diameter of the particle. And you can see the recorded signal here, and you can see that the signal increase is very sensitive to the diameter of the bits. For the same volume, you will have a much bigger signal if you increase the diameter of the bits. And if we want to find scaling laws, we find that the seismic energy is proportional to the diameter of the bit to the power 3. So when you see that, you have the feeling that maybe it's related to the mass, because the mass would be proportional to the number of grains times the diameter to the power 3. But if you fix now the diameter, here 2 millimeters for example, and you vary the mass, but still you see an increase of the seismic energy, and the seismic energy for the same grain diameter is proportional to the mass of the flow. So then you start to see the complexity of all this. But maybe the mass effect will happen at frequencies that will be different to the frequency on which the diameter. And all this is to find the signature of this process. And again, you can find other relations. For example, if you vary just the initial height of the column, you see that the seismic energy for different slope angle is proportional to the square of the thickness of the mass. So everything is a little bit mixed up, but we can see different signature of the mass characteristics, and it is why we were able to find some thickness, for example, from the seismic signal. Okay, so maybe I will not, so just to see, for example, you can propose a law that relates the seismic energy to the grain diameter to the power 3 and to the thickness of the mass to the square, for example. And this will depend on the slope angle and on the tangent of the friction angle. So you see that you have some correlation between the two. And the idea now is to try to explain why we have such correlation, from what it comes from. Okay. So, and to do that, I just go a little bit further. Okay. Okay. So, maybe because here I show you some relation and it is interesting, but we don't know really why they happen. So to try to understand better what we did simple flows at the laboratory scale, not columns that we release, that accelerate, decelerate, etc., but just uniform flows. So we release some mass here, and they generate uniform flows, and we did that for different slope angles, and we try to investigate what generates these seismic waves. You will show the movie where now we capture the motion of each particle with a fast camera, not the ensemble of particles, but here this is the flow, and you can see the velocity of each bits here. The red represents the velocity vector of each particle. You can see that they are static at the bed, and they move faster on the top. And you can see that sometimes you have one particle that falls down on a hole, and you have kind of a motion like this for the particles to go over the neighbor here. And the question is that, can we see that in the seismic signal that is generated by these flows? So to do that, what we measure, we have a fast camera, but we put also some accelerometers on the plate, and we measure the acoustic waves that are generated by these flows. So from this fast camera, we can recover velocity profile. So here is the velocity that is normalized here by g times the diameter of particle. And you can see that as the slope angle, here this is the slope angle increases, you have obviously higher velocity. And you recover the very small velocity on near the bed, and higher velocity on the free surface of the flow here. And here, this is what we will be interested in, is the velocity fluctuation here. So you have strong velocity fluctuation at the surface, and as you go down, you have a smaller velocity fluctuation here. And here I represented only this velocity fluctuation. So I remove the mean velocity, u, and just the velocity fluctuations that are related to the collision between the particles that we expect to be the source of seismic waves. And you see that the velocity fluctuation increases as we go up to the free surface. And when the slope angle increases, then you have higher velocity fluctuation, which is intuitively expected. So from this we can calculate strain rate, which I called gamma dot, which is something that is play a role in rheological laws. And we have something that is very important in granular physics, which is called the inertial number. And the inertial number is a number which gives a ratio of time scales. You have the time scale of shearing of the strain rate gamma dot, and you have the time scale of pressure related to the reaction to pressure. And this inertial number, I will speak about that tomorrow, plays a role in the rheological laws. For example, the friction coefficient is expected to depend on this inertial number. So it's always important to measure it, and we expect all the quantities to depend on this inertial number. So we can see that this inertial number increases as we go to the free surface of the flow. So now, if you look at this mean velocity here, it seems quite regular, and when you looked at the movie, it seems like the particles are just flowing in a steady, uniform way. But if you look now at the velocity fluctuations that we are interested in at different slope angle, for example, here 16 degrees and 80 degrees, you see that the motion is very complex. You have a vortex of velocity fluctuations that are very heterogeneous. So the flow seems to be homogeneous, steady, uniform, but in fact, the fluctuations are very, very strong in granular flows. And this is something that we really want to measure, and this is related to what we call granular temperature. So the granular temperature is the square of the velocity fluctuations. And so if I represented here this granular temperature as a function of the strain rate, it seems that in the measurements, so this is different experiments where we incline the slope, and when we put different thickness of the flow, and we see that the granular temperature seems to be to scale with the strain rate, but also with the velocity and also with the inertial number. So we don't know really which one is the most important, and we have to do better, more accurate experiments to discriminate between the three. But still we see that the velocity fluctuations are about proportional to the average velocity of the flow. So if you remember, the starting objective that we had was to recover flow parameters from the seismic signal. And if we assume that the high frequency is generated by collision that are related to this, then maybe we will be able, by measuring high frequency signal, to recover the mean velocity of the flow. It is also something that we think we will be able to do when we will better understand the things. In a few years, maybe, I don't know. So now you was asking about frequency, content, spectrum. And so we try to investigate this. So here you have the frequency, the spectrogram that you observe for 16 degrees and here 18 degrees of slope. And here I put the mean frequency that you can measure in your spectrogram. And you see that when you increase the slope angle, you get higher mean frequency. And so I will show some results and then interpret it later. And also, this is the mean frequency, and what you observe here is kind of strange vertical stripes in the spectrogram here. It's a modulation frequency, which is much lower than the mean frequency. Because, for example, the mean frequency here is about 25 kilohertz, and the frequency of these stripes here is more 25 hertz. So you have here kilohertz and here hertz. So you see two typical frequencies in your signal. And the mean frequency in kilohertz, I have no time to explain, but it is exactly the range of frequencies that are expected for a collision between two particles if you assume the Hertz theory. Hertz theory means that you have two elastic particles when they collide. You have a typical time of collision, and this frequency is just 1 over the time of collision. And we did a lot of experiments, we have several papers on that, where we just release one bit, and we can show that the acoustic signal that you measure is related to this collision time. So from the frequency, you can recover the collision time, and actually the collision time depends on the mass and velocity of the particles. So this is another way of extracting information by measuring frequencies. So here we understand a little bit. So this frequency is related to the collision time between two particles due to Hertz elastic contact. And this frequency actually, it corresponds if we look very carefully into the optic data, and if we follow one particle, we see that if we follow it in space, here is along the slope, we see the particle doing that in the vertical direction, and it's when it tries to overcome the other particle. You remember maybe on the movie? Here. If you look at one particle, you see that it goes down and then comes up, and this one, and it goes down when it moves above the other. And actually, you can record it from the seismic signal, and you can see that this frequency here is about the frequency that is measured between this vertical line. So you can see that you have a lot of very detailed information if you understand your signal. So now, is it possible to build a simple model by this understanding to try to predict the acoustic energy from the individual motion of particles? First, we try to see empirical relation, and we see that this is PEL is elastic power. This is the energy divided by the time of observation. And we see that the seismic power is proportional to the granular temperature. So we expect that by measuring this acoustic energy, we will be able to have a measurement of the granular temperature, which is really impossible to measure in other way, except by looking really at the details of each particles. So we can see that the seismic power is also proportional to I, the inertial number, and the frequency also is proportional to the inertial number. So now let us look at a simple model. So I told you that actually what we measure in some way is related to the collision between the particles. So what we say, okay, maybe what we measure, I called it synthetic elastic power, is just the sum of the collision of each particle. So I have a layer of particles, so I have Ni layer, and at each layer I have colliding particles that generate a seismic energy related to this collision. But what I measure is at the bottom of the layer, so I have attenuation of the waves within the layer before they reach the acoustic sensors that are on the bottom of the layer. So this is the simplest model that you can build from this understanding. So this is really a big issue also, attenuation in granular flows. And there are several labs that are working on that, but typical value of attenuation of waves within a granular layer is 100 meter minus 1. So if I take this value, for this I have the attenuation, and now if I take the Hertz theory, which is very well defined, you can see that the seismic energy released by two particles that are colliding is proportional to the diameter of the particle to the power 5 and to the velocity fluctuation, to the velocity at which the particle collides. So we have this, and now Ni, we have to define Ni, which is the number of impact per second, and that are dependent on the area over which we measure. divided by the area of the bits times the frequency of collision. So if we do all that, we can calculate synthetic seismic power and compare it to what we measure. So this is what we measure here, and this is the synthetic power here. And we see that we are able to quite well recover the measured seismic power from this simple model. This is true only with this value of the attenuation, and if you vary the attenuation, it can change a lot. So this is not something that is resolved. But still, it seems from this that really what we measure is the sum of the colliding particles at this frequency range. So at high frequency, and now we are speaking about hertz, kilohertz, and not to a very low seismic signal as the one I showed you at the beginning of the talk. So this is completely different information that you can extract from high frequency signal than the one that you can extract from low frequency. And obviously a challenge is to relate the two. So, okay. So, I don't know if I continue or if I let place for question now. I can. Okay. So, do you have some question about this first part or? Yes?
Yeah, I have a question for the previous part.
Mm-hmm.
You know that your results stand. So if I well understand, you start from a position not at the equilibrium.
Yes.
Thank you. So if I well understand, you start from a position not at the equilibrium, and you deduce from the flow a force. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you try the opposite? I mean, start from a position almost at the equilibrium everywhere with a small layer of, let's say, detritus or of something that can move, and you put a force at the beginning and see if you recover the good displacement.
You mean you put, for example, a perturbation on the initial static layer? Because you have to make it move.
Yeah, but you can move the substratum, the non-erodable bottom. This bottom can move, and then don't move.
Yeah, but it is the same kind of things that you obtain. What we did, which is maybe another part of your question, is that we start with a layer at rest, and we imply some seismic perturbation to make the layer moves, and we see that when we put seismic perturbation, then the layer that was initially at rest will move. This is something that we did.
Thank you.
Maybe, does anyone else have a question, maybe?
Thank you. Because of the importance of the bathymetry and on the lack of knowledge that one may have on this, are there any experiments on data assimilation done to recover the bathymetry, the initial bathymetry when there is erosion, in order to improve the models?
You mean field acquisition?
Yeah,
there is a lot of,
But yeah, field acquisition, but implemented into the model to do some real data assimilation to correct the trajectory of the model in order to predict the movement of the flow.
But I mean, recovering the bathymetry from simulation, you mean? Or what? I don't.
Reconstructing, let's say, from a mixed some data assimilation between the model and the field measurements or any type of data that you may have that could allow to know the initial bathymetry that was not measured at all by anyone or even by the model.
Yeah, this is very, very difficult because the bathymetry change in all direction and at all position. And we try some, for example, if we want to recover the initial shape of the mass that was released, we can do some comparison with field observation. And for example, we did that for seismic data. And by changing the direction of the mass, we can recover the most probable bathymetry that was observed on the field. But the limitation of this low frequency analysis is really you have to have the real bathymetry, because then it would make too many uncertainties, unknowns in the model.
Okay, location.
Okay, I can continue for 5 minutes or stop. I don't know. Okay, but maybe I continue for 5 minutes about go back to the field after these experiments. And so I show you low frequency seismic data, then I show you that high frequency seismic data can be interpreted in laboratory experiments as a collision due to collisions, and that they are related to loss of potential energy. So now we can wonder if it is observable on the field or if it's really something that is observed just on laboratory experiments. And so I go back to the Piton de la Fournaise crater here in La Réunion and look at the seismic signal that we record for each rockfall. So now we calculate the seismic energy for each rockfall, so each dot represents one rockfall. And we have 10 years of data, and each day we have at least 10 rockfalls. So we have thousands of rockfalls that we recorded since the last 10 to 20 years. So here I just took a period of 1 year, and each dot is a point, and you see, if you plot the seismic energy as a function of seismic duration, you recover these things that in geophysics we call a correlation. Even though you have a strong dispersion of your data. But if you look at the correlation, you see seismic energy seems to vary as the duration of the signal to a given power, beta, that is 1.56. This is observation. And we can observe that at different stations. And because I showed you before what we observed on the experiments, you have the feeling that the seismic energy maybe is related to the loss of potential energy of the rockfall from the top to the bottom. And it is what we wanted to check. So now if you look at analytical solution of thin layer models that I showed you before, you can show analytically that the loss of potential energy of a mass that you release on a slope, that at the end comes to a horizontal plane, then this loss of potential energy is proportional to the duration of the flow to a power 2. So it's not so far from the power 1.5 that we observed. And because on the lab I saw that seismic energy is proportional to loss of potential energy, and because on the field I saw that the duration of seismic signal is about the duration of the flow, maybe the two are related. So from all that I showed you before, we can say that the duration of the flow is the same as the duration of seismic signal, and the loss of potential energy is proportional to the seismic energy. But I wonder why I find 2 in the analytical solution and 1.5 on the field. So to try to investigate this topography effect that you were asking, we simulate a lot of flow, but now on the real topography, and we observed a change of the scaling laws, and now the loss of potential energy is proportional to the flow duration to a power which is 1.6, which is much closer to the power that I found in the seismic data. So now I see that I have really close correlation between seismic observation and flow observation, and I can put all together on the same graph. So this is the seismic energy as a function of the duration for each rockfall here, And here is the loss of potential energy as a function of flow duration for each simulation on the crater. And I see that I have quite comparable slopes. And I can deduce from that a ratio between loss of potential energy and seismic energy, which is on the field, this is just observation, 10 to the power minus 4. And I don't know if you remember, but in the lab experiment it was about the same. So it is very consistent what we observed on the field and what we measured and tried to understand at the lab scale. So we are quite confident to this, and this is very powerful because here now we can relate the seismic energy that is very easy to measure. We have a seismometer, we measure seismic energy. Then if we know the ratio between the two, we can deduce a loss of potential energy. And from simulation or analytical model, we can recover the volume of the rockfall. So because we understood all these processes, now we are able to find a relation between the volume of the rockfall and the seismic energy that we measure on the crater. And this is very useful because now what we can do, we take our 20 years of data, we detect an event. I will not enter because it's complicated, but we can detect the rockfall. Then we can calculate its energy with the relation that I showed you before. We can calculate its volume and its location with other techniques. And we can now have the location, the time, and the volume of rockfalls during the 20 years of data, and correlate all these time series with volcanic activity of climatic change and not climatic, meteorological change, and etc. And we can have, for example, the repartition of volume of rockfall during 1 year. And you see, for example, here we have a lot of rockfall here, and in another period it will change. You will have a lot of rockfall here, etc. And okay, maybe I have to stop and I will continue, but all this to say that we have to do all this understanding, simulation, comparison with seismic data, with laboratory experiments, to believe a little bit on what we observed on the field, and believe a little bit on what we can deduce as information on real landslide from the measured seismic signal. Okay. Thank you.